In your bulletin, you should have a full-size sheet called Jesus Before Pilate and Herod, a Gospel Harmony. We're going to be using that this morning because we're going to move quickly through the story, picking up some highlights from all four Gospels pulled together. We're focusing on John chapter 18 and 19 and pulling in the rest of the Gospels into our story. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Jesus, please come and enlighten us, teach us, open our minds and hearts to hear all that you have for us today. We pray in your name. Amen. So if you put together the story of Jesus on the night of his betrayal and morning of his crucifixion, you have him taken from Gethsemane to the household compound of Caiaphas, the high priest, and of course he's first sent before Annas for kind of a pre-trial hearing. Annas is kind of the power under the hood of the high priestly family. And he asked Jesus a few questions, and they send Jesus over to Caiaphas, where some of the Sanhedrin members have gathered. And there's a midnight mock trial, which is illegal, out of time. Justice always had to happen in the daylight. But they're test-driving ideas. They bribe some witnesses and bring them in, but they don't seem to agree. They accuse Jesus of claiming to plan a terrorist attack on the temple. He said he's going to blow up the temple. He's going to tear it down. Build it again in 3 days, but he's going to tear down the temple. But even then, it doesn't really stick. The false witnesses don't agree. So finally, Caiaphas does this mock sense of shock, and he commands Jesus, tell us if you're the Messiah, the Son of God. And now Jesus, who's been silent, to be silent at this point would be to bear false witness. And so he speaks, yes, you have said it, true, I am. And he quotes Daniel chapter 7, hereafter you're going to see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Caiaphas tears his robe as if this is terrible blasphemy. And they condemn Jesus. So now they've got their method figured out. Then they abuse Jesus till dawn, it says. The crowd there of senators of the Jewish nation have a chance to take out their hatred on Jesus. He's getting in the way of all of their big plans of how they're going to control everybody else and have all the wealth and power. And as soon as the sun rises, Luke says, they gather in the Sanhedrin council for the official legal trial. The sun has risen. They know exactly how they're going to do it. They bring Jesus in. They ask him if he's the Son of God. He says yes again, and they condemn him. There's a slight interruption as Judas comes in and throws the money down. But they haul Jesus over then to Pilate. Now, as we notice what happens with Pilate, and we've been through this before, so we're going to look at it very quickly as we move forward today. The second section there in your Harmony of the Gospel, verse 33. Actually, no, we should back up a little bit. Verse 29. Pilate says, what accusation do you bring against this man? And the Jewish rulers say, hey, he's an evildoer. We brought him. Don't worry about the details. I want you to notice that Pilate refuses to be co-opted by their supposed authority. He says, if you don't want me to look at the evidence, then verse 31, you take him and judge him by your own law. He says, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And they say, well, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. And they begin to accuse him. Gospel of Luke says there in verse 2. We found this guy perverting the nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he's Christ the King. Yes, he said he was Christ the King, right? No, he did not forbid to pay taxes. That was a bold-faced lie, and Pilate never picks that one up. And was he perverting the nation, twisting the nation? In a way, yes. In a way, no. If you are the power structure and he's setting the poor free, then he's perverting everything. But if you're the poor and he's setting you free against the power structure, then he's the great hero. So it depends on which way you look at it. So Pilate pulls Jesus inside the praetorium, right-hand column, verse 33. Are you the king of the Jews? He asked Jesus. And Jesus, as we noted earlier, goes after Pilate's heart. He says, is this a question from yourself, or are you just doing business? Do you really want to know? Pilate says, am I a Jew? Come on. Your nation, your chief priest delivered you to me. What have you done? In other words, Pilate says, let's talk about you. And Jesus says, no, let's talk about you. And Pilate says, no, let's talk about you. Jesus says, my kingdom's not of this world. So evidently he has a kingdom. If my kingdom were of this world, my soldiers would fight so that I would not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. My kingdom is fundamentally different from your kingdom and Caesar's kingdom, and I am not a threat to Caesar's power. And we don't fight like Caesar's soldiers. Pilate said, are you a king then? Jesus answered, you say rightly, I am a king. For this cause I was born. He's a king with a cause. And for this cause I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. He's a king of a kingdom of truth, not a kingdom of brute force. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So once again, Jesus is going after Pilate's heart. Pilate, are you interested in truth? Anyone who's interested in truth is going to listen to what I have to say. He's inviting Pilate to hear what he has to say, at which point Pilate passes the ball back and says, what is truth? And walks out to the Jews. I want you to notice, Pilate was not willing to simply take the Jews' statement, if he weren't an evildoer, we wouldn't have brought him, just sign the death warrant. Pilate insists on at least attempting to be a just ruler. There's something in Pilate that is not completely gone yet. And Jesus goes after that and tries to pull it out, but Pilate resists. He goes out in verse 38 and essentially says, I find him not guilty. I find no fault. Oh, but they're more fierce in the column of Luke. He stirs up the people, teaching from Judea, teaching throughout all Judea, but he began in Galilee before he came here. Skipping down in the Luke column, Pilate heard Galilee. He now has an opportunity to pass the buck. Anybody like to pass the buck? When you have to make a difficult decision? I sat down with someone yesterday and they said, Pastor, we've got to do something about this. And I said, okay. And we sat there and we decided what needed to be done. And then that person said, and you need to do it. Unfortunately, he was right and I have to do it. I would love to pass the buck. If any of you want to make the phone call for me, come talk to me afterward. Pilate tries to pass the buck. He sends Jesus over to Herod, who happens to be the Galilean ruler who's in Jerusalem at the time. And if you read that little section there, Jesus doesn't say a word to Herod. There's evidently nothing left in Herod to try to draw out. Herod is a hardened ruler, ruthless, totally into his own power, and Jesus doesn't say a word to him. All Herod does is start commanding Jesus to do a miracle, and Jesus is silent. They abuse him, mock him, dress him up like a king in a gorgeous robe, and send him back to Pilate. Verse 13. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and rulers of the people, because he couldn't pass the buck, it got passed back to him, said, "You've brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. I have examined him in your presence and find him not guilty concerning these charges." Herod didn't either. He sent him back to me. "I will therefore chastise him and release him." Now the word for chastise there, the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, use two different words, both of which clearly mean flogging or whipping. And the Roman scourge was a punishment designed to leave an impression that would never be forgotten. The Roman scourge left you generally maimed for life. A wooden handle, some say 3, some say 7 thongs of leather about 3 feet long, into which they would take bits of bone that they had bored holes in and thread it over and tie it with knots, or bits of metal. And they would, there's 2 possible ways. They would tie the person's wrists over her head on a post, or the other way, they would bend the person over and tie them down near the ground. But in either case, they basically ripped the flesh off most of your body, back, chest, legs, with these thongs with bone in it. It would wrap around and they'd pull. Generally figured they used 2 different slaves to do the flogging, one on each side, one and then the other. The Jewish rule given by God was that if you whip someone, now we don't know anything necessarily that the Old Testament whipping involved this kind of torture, but if you whip someone in the Old Testament for a crime, it couldn't be more than 40 lashes. And so the Jews were very careful to never do more than 39 in case they got the count off by 1. They wouldn't break the law. The Romans knew no such rule. Their idea of a flogging was to whip the person until they were just short of dead. The idea was to nearly kill them and then take them out and crucify them. And sometimes they went overboard and the person died, and probably was to their benefit at that point, because what was coming next was even worse. Now, at this point in the Gospel of Luke, it doesn't say that they scourged Jesus. It doesn't say that they whipped Jesus. What Pilate says is, I'm not going to put him to death for what you say, but I will. The word is not the word for whip or chastise in that way. It's the word for discipline. Discipline. For teaching. It's built on the word paideos, from which we get pedagogy, which has to do with teaching. A child was a paideon, a pedion, from which we get a pedophile, someone who abuses children. A pedion or a paideon was a child, and it's not really a reference to size or smallness or the word for a baby. It's a learner, one who's under instruction. That's what the word means. A teacher is a paidutes, an instructor. If you are under training, you're under paideia. So it's all about instruction. Basically, if you wanted to translate this in colloquial English, Pilate says, I'll learn him and release him. Okay? I'll teach him a lesson. You guys don't like what he's doing. I will impress upon him to stop it and let him go. I'm not going to kill him. This word is used for Moses was learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians. Doesn't mean he was whipped in the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was learned. He was taught. Paul says he was raised a Pharisee, taught according to the law of the fathers. Paul says to Timothy that certain men need to learn, not to discipline. And Hebrews talks about we don't like it very well when God chastises us. It doesn't mean whips us. It means disciplines us. So at this point, according to the Gospel of Luke, it's as if Pilate is saying, listen, I'm not going to just kill this guy because you want him dead, but I will impress him to stop doing whatever he's doing that's annoying you. And undoubtedly, he's speaking of a Roman whipping, a scourge. But at this point, what Pilate is trying to say is, I'm not going to do what you want just because you want it, but I will do enough to impress him to stop doing what he's doing. I will chastise him, I'll learn him and release him. Now this is the point, the bottom section there, where it brings up the whole subject of Barabbas. If you read the 4 Gospels together, It's hard to tell whether Pilate brought up the subject of Barabbas or the people brought up the subject of Barabbas. But there was a custom that at Passover, the Roman ruler would pacify the mob, the huge gathering of Jews that often broke out into a revolt and a riot, that he would pacify them by releasing a prisoner, a political prisoner, someone who was probably incarcerated because of their rabid attitude against the Romans, because the Jews hated the Roman rule. Remember, they wanted to condemn Jesus just by catching him agreeing with paying taxes to Caesar. They wanted nothing to do with Caesar, and these very men behind the scenes constantly nurtured terrorist cells who would break out in any way they could and kill Romans, especially soldiers. So whether Pilate brings this up to pacify them or they bring it up, we're not quite sure, but this subject comes up of release someone to us that we want. And so Pilate decides he'll play Barabbas, who's probably the most notorious, it says. He was a murderer in an insurrection, which would make him a Jewish hero, right? He killed some Romans. The question is, do you want the one who kills Romans, or do you want the one who heals the sick? Which one do you want? Do you want Jesus? And I want you to notice what he says in the Gospel of Mark. Clear down 4 lines from the bottom. Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? Now, in a way, Pilate is sticking the dagger in and turning it, isn't it? Do you want me to release to you your king? Or do you want me to release to you this counter-revolutionary? Which do you want? And again, Pilate's passing the buck again. He's hoping to get out of the tough situation by appeasing the crowd. He promises to appease them by learning Jesus, but then he hopes to get out of it by giving them someone back. As if to say, Jesus is under my authority now. Do you want him or do you want Barabbas? And of course, the chief priests stir up the people, can flip the page over, to ask for Barabbas. In the Matthew column, verse 21, which of the two do you want me to release to you? And they cried out, Barabbas. Luke, away with this man, release Barabbas. John, not this man, but Barabbas. Barabbas was a robber. He'd been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Pilate called out again. We're in the Luke column, verse 20. Moving over to Mark. What do you want me to do with him who you call the King of the Jews? And they shout out, crucify him. A third time, according to the Gospel of Luke, verse 22. Why? What evil has he done? I found no reason for death in him. He's trying to reason with a mob. I will chastise him and let him go. I'll whip him good. I'll learn him good. But I'm going to let him go. And they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and the chief priests prevailed. So according to Matthew, Pilate now sits down, has them bring some water, and he washes his hands in front of them all, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this person. You see to it. And the people cried out, his blood be on us and on our children. Then Pilate gave sentence, according to the Gospel of Luke, that they should do as he requested. And they took Jesus, John 19, verse 1, and scourged him. So Jesus now is tied to the post and whipped to within an inch of death. And he released Barabbas. And he delivered Jesus to be crucified. The soldiers whipped Jesus, and then they abused him. You can read that in Matthew and Mark. They took him away into the praetorium. He was probably scourged in front of the crowd, because this was done as an intimidation method. You didn't do this in private. You do this for all to see. This is what you get if you go up against Caesar. Then the soldiers take him inside. They put a purple robe on him. They dress him like a king. They put a crown on his head of thorns. And they start striking him on the head and in the face. And they mock him, "Hail, King of the Jews." These Roman soldiers are now having a ball. Their hatred for the Jewish people, who are constantly attacking them with guerrilla warfare, now comes out. Their king, they get a chance to abuse. And they take it out on Jesus, and they spit on him, and they bow the knee and mock worship him. "Hail, King of the Jews." And when they had mocked him, John chapter 19, verse 4, near the bottom, Pilate then went out again and said, "Behold, I'm bringing out to you, that you may know that I find him not guilty." And Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said, "Behold the man." You get the feeling he's hoping for a bit of sympathy. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And Pilate said, "You take him and crucify him. I find no fault in him." And the Jews said, "We have a law that according to our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." And all of a sudden, Pilate was spooked. And he takes Jesus back inside and says, "Where are you from? Who are you?" It's almost as if the Jews said one sentence too much. They had the verdict. He turned Jesus over to be crucified. And then they go blurting out, "Yeah, but he ought to die even though you find no fault because he claimed to be the Son of God." And I think God used that to tweak Pilate's mind. And Pilate's saying, "Wait a minute, what is going on here?" Because Pilate believed in the gods. There are all kinds of gods. This could be one. And Jesus' demeanor was unlike that of any man in this circumstance. And so now Pilate pulls Jesus back inside. "Where are you from?" Jesus said nothing. Verse 10, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know I have the power to crucify you or release you?" And Jesus said, "You could have no power against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But notice, so one more time, Pilate is ready to go with the mob, and he draws back one more time. He doesn't want to do this. And we missed one little line at the bottom of the previous page, where somewhere in the middle of all this, while Pilate's sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sends him a message saying, "Have nothing to do with this just man. I've suffered many things in a dream because of him." There's a lot of stuff going on here that has Pilate unsettled about just being a ruthless executioner. And he wants to let Jesus go. Pilate sought, it says verse 12, again near the bottom of the back side of the page. He sought to release Jesus. He desired to release. Well, he had the power to. Why didn't he just do it? But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. If you don't do what we say, we will turn you into Caesar for having let a rival king go unchecked." And Pilate knows the Caesars of these days love to find some rich noble who they could get some kind of a charge against, at which point they would banish them and seize all their wealth. This is just the rule of the day of the Caesars of that time. Pilate knows that for the least little pretext, the very Caesar that gave him his job will take everything he has. They have Pilate's hand behind his back and they're twisting it. Verse 13, Pilate therefore heard that saying. When he had heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in the place called the Pavement. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." He points at Jesus. "Look, there's your king." You talk about sticking the knife in and twisting it. They cried out, "Away with him! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate says. He twists the knife again. And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Pilate had just gotten the Jewish leaders to bow and pledge allegiance to the Caesar they hated. He'd at least gotten a small victory out of being manipulated by these Jews. And he delivered Jesus to be crucified, and they took him away, took his purple robe off, put his own clothes back on, and led him out to crucify him. I find an enigma in two ways in this story. Number one, Pilate still seems to have a heart. He still seems to have a conscience. And his wife's dream and Jesus' conversation, his refusal to be just manipulated by the Jews at first anyway, he's trying to find some way to do, it appears to be, at least from his viewpoint, the right thing. Because he knows, it says, they brought him because of envy. They brought Jesus to him because of envy. Why can't he seem to do it? Now, the flip side is this whole thing with the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders, their intense hatred of the Romans, their attempt to discredit Jesus by just getting Jesus to say don't pay taxes, the fact that in the background they're nurturing terrorist cells to take out Romans every chance they can, and yet they now want a Roman to do something for them, and they want it so bad that they end up saying, "We have no king but Caesar." What you have is powerful people manipulating each other. And they're all too weak to stand up for each other's manipulation. That's why I called this sermon "Powerfully Weak Men." How is it that Jews who have set their faces to resist Rome at all costs now are bowing, and Pilate, who has the power to let Jesus go and wants to, doesn't, and end up having him crucified? And I think it's a problem of momentum. Momentum. You know what momentum is? If you get your car going, you're going 75 miles an hour, and you come to one of those signs with a curve on it that says 35, what's the first thing you do? You check your momentum by looking down at the speedometer and say, "Yep, I'm going too fast." And then you check your momentum the other way by putting on the brake and slowing down, right? Momentum is an amazing thing. That's why they have those emergency off-ramps for trucks on steep hills, right? You can get the truck going fast enough with that much weight that there's too much momentum for the brakes to do anything about it. That's why you have a steep hill and it says trucks 35. I remember a hill coming down out of Bernie Falls in Northern California. I was towing a fifth-wheel trailer behind my pickup, and it had, together I weighed about, the whole truck and trailer weighed about 20,000, which is very heavy for a pickup, and its braking system. And that is like an 8% grade. It's really steep. It's about a mile long, and at the bottom is a 15-mile-an-hour curve. I remember taking longer to go down that hill than when I'd gone up it. I stopped at the top. I put the thing in first gear, granny, and I went down it at about 10 miles an hour. Why did I go so slow? I didn't want to build up enough momentum, but what my brakes could stop me at any point. Because if I got down near the bottom and I was going too fast, I could slam the brakes down all I want to. All they're going to do is heat up, go out, and I'm going to not make the corner. Momentum. Momentum. Powerfully weak men. It's interesting to note how people tend to end up going where they're headed. I realize that doesn't sound terribly profound, but it might be. you're going to end up where you're headed. Does it ever frustrate you that the politicians bellyache and moan about the debt and then promptly vote to spend more money? It's called momentum. I believe that early on in our lives, at some point, and I don't know exactly when it is, but at some point fairly early in our lives, I believe we all make some basic decisions. The decision, are we going to go after whatever we want and can get any way we can get it, set our own course, write our own story? Are we going to do it our way and get our way, power, control, and wealth? In fact, there are generally three areas, I think, that get most of us. Wealth, materialism, greed, stuff. The worker trying to survive, the person driven to become a millionaire. It's all about survival, getting enough to make it through, or getting as much as I can. Material things. Pleasure. Have you noticed some people's lives just seem to be driven by pleasure? They don't care if they live in a wreck of a place, drive a wreck of a car, as long as they can find the next experience. Whether it's drugs or whether it's rock climbing or whatever it is. Doesn't matter about having stuff, it's the experience. We can call it hedonism, but it's a search for pleasure. And then the third one is power. Imperialism, control. If I'm just in charge, life will be good. Now, what motivates someone all the way to Capitol Hill to be in the House or the Senate or the President or whatever is usually power. And I find it interesting how men of great power and women of great power don't seem to be able to control things once they get the power. Because you're going to end up where you're headed. If you're willing to sacrifice whatever you have to, including your integrity, to get to power, when you have the power, you're powerless to use it well. Because you sold out to the manipulation of the masses to get there. When you get there, you'll simply continue to try to manipulate the masses, even though you know good and well what you ought to do. It's called momentum. That's why Jesus says it's not where you get, but it's how you get there that matters. If you're working like the devil for the Lord, you're going to end up working for the devil. If you don't use God's way, you can't get to God's end. And even if you appear to get there, you're not there. The only way to arrive at love is through the means of love. And if you use any other means, you won't get to love. Do you follow me? Momentum. You're going to end up where you're headed. And early on in life, the default decision that I'm afraid most people make is to get what I want, the way I want, any way I can get it. I'm going to get the power, I'm going to get the control, I'm going to get the wealth, I'm going to get the pleasure. I'll take it any way I can get it. But early on in life, I believe God is talking to everyone's heart, saying there is another way. That way leads to death. Because if you take out anybody you have to get where you want to go, somebody else will take you out. And even if you're the strongest, finally somebody will come along who's stronger. And king of the mountain, the king never stays on top of the mountain very long. Somebody else pulls him down. And I believe Jesus comes along and he tries to tell us that when we're young, that is not a way that will lead to life. There is another way that leads to life, and it's the way of love, putting others first, living by a larger story, not writing your own story, but recognizing there's more going on in the universe. It doesn't all revolve around you. You are not the main event, but you're incredibly important to a God who loves you. But there's a war going on, and we're called to walk in a world that's headed to hell, going a totally different direction. We're called to walk through a world that's living on selfishness by living selflessness. And the one who dies will live, and gives will gain, and it makes no sense to the world. But God says, walk to the beat of a different drummer. Go a different direction. Now, when Jesus uses this in a parable, he says that the way of the world is like a wide way going downhill. Now, what does it take to build up momentum going downhill? Do nothing. You'll pick up speed. And the longer you go, the faster you're going and the greater momentum. It's like a freight train. It takes a long time to stop a freight train. But Jesus says his way is a narrow path going uphill. Now, how do you gain momentum going uphill? Paul says press forward, right? You can't just kick back and relax and do nothing and gain momentum going uphill. You got to be putting some energy into it. And what happens if you ever stop putting the energy into it? It's a funny thing, the momentum doesn't last. Have you ever noticed good habits are easy to break and bad habits are hard to break? Yeah, you're working uphill, you're going against the grain, you're going upstream, and everything's trying to wash you back. And if you don't keep pressing on, it will stall you out, and the next thing you know, you're going downhill. And it helps me a bit when I realize, why is it so hard to walk with Jesus sometimes? Because I'm going against the grain. It is uphill. It's not the coasting thing. You can't get up the narrow path unless you decide that's the direction you're going to go. But if you've been going down the wide path and picked up a lot of speed, like Pilate, been doing his thing all these years, going after power and wealth, and Jesus is standing in front of him and he says, there's a 15-mile-an-hour off-ramp. Why don't you take it? You're past it before you even know it was there, right? And it's hard to slow down and take it. The longer you head in one way, the harder it is to head a different way. Interestingly enough, all the evidence shows that the vast majority of people who ever choose to follow Christ during their lives do so as young people. We rescue a few older folks now and then. Maybe you're one of those that got rescued. But very few people in their mature years make that change. It's 30 and down, and it's mostly teen and preteen. It's those that, though they may wander, they lose momentum in the teen years and slip back a ways, they get their momentum back in later life. Very few people. And this is what I find interesting. Pilate has built up a momentum with his life, and Jesus himself is trying to get him to put on the brakes, make the corner. You don't have to go downhill. And Pilate wants to, but generally you're going to end up where you're headed. And the Jews, same thing. Their momentum is anti-Rome, but their greater momentum is power and control. And these Jewish leaders have spent all their lives working on power and control, and now they're willing to go contrary to their most cherished nationalistic beliefs and bow and give subservience to Caesar publicly because their greater momentum is power and control. And they can't control themselves. I mean, wouldn't Satan have been smart to not torture Jesus to the point where the rest of the universe saw him completely unmasked? Wouldn't it have been smart if he could have gone through the cross whole event and kept on that mask of the good guy? But he couldn't help himself. His momentum took him right past it into the very orgy of pain and terror that hung himself before the universe. The point is, you're going to end up where you're going. We need something in our lives to check our momentum. Don't we? We all know how quickly we're sliding downhill. And we need something to check our momentum. And I believe God's given us some things to check our momentum. And there's some of the things that people want to get rid of the most. I'll pick on 2, 3. I believe that the weekly seventh-day Sabbath is one of the chief ways that God picks to check our momentum. He says, you don't pick the time, I pick the time. Once a week, seventh day, sunset to sunset. Shut down the business, stop trying to survive, and check in with me. And what do you have? The book of Amos. The merchant saying, oh, when will this Sabbath be over so we can make more money? They're missing the whole point. God says, I'm going to put once a week something directly in your way that says, stop. That's what Shabbat means, cease. Stop. Check your speed. Check your direction. Check in with me. He puts speed bumps in the way so we can't get going too fast the wrong way. Tithing, I believe, is another one. He says, when you get that check, give me 10%. Ay, that's a lot of money. How can I pay the bills? He says, I'll pour out a blessing too big for you to receive. Trust me. Write the check. Where your treasure is where your heart is. So when your check comes, it checks the momentum of your heart. Which direction is your heart going? Do you need to slow down and take an exit? So once a week, there's a check with the Sabbath. Every week or two, there's a check with your check and the tithe. And as I've been thinking about it this way, I think this is where daily devotions fit in. We get busy. We don't have time to sit down and spend a half hour with Jesus. Why? Because our momentum is built up in the wrong direction. And he says, sit down. I'll show up with breakfast. I'm knocking on the door. Sit down. Let's eat. I'm too busy, Lord. Jesus says, I'm trying to check your momentum. Every day we have to stop and choose our direction. Not because we got lost overnight, but because it's so easy to slide downhill. Stop and check your momentum. These powerfully weak men, the Jewish leaders and Pilate, they want to do one thing, but their momentum takes them another direction. And if you let too much momentum build up, it's hard to change directions. And so God gives us things, and there are things we resist because we don't like to check our momentum, do we? We don't like those come to Jesus talks. We don't like those reality moments. But God says, if I don't interrupt your momentum, if I don't check your momentum, you're going to end up sliding in the wrong direction. Just one little final note on this. This is why another reason why I believe Christian education is so vital. when our children are young, yes, they need to learn to read and write and do arithmetic. But what are they being taught while they're learning to read and write and do arithmetic? Are they being taught a God worldview? That there's a bigger story that we're called into and there's a way of life? Or are they being taught, which is the avowed agenda of public education, that there is no God, that you're on your own, that, someday the sun's going to turn into either a red dwarf or a blue giant, and we're either going to freeze or burn up, right? We came from bang, we're going to bang. And survival is of the fittest and the strongest. But of course, we talk anti-war while we teach our children that the only way of life is the power of might. Makes no sense. But here's the point. If your child is sitting for 6 hours a day with a system that's deliberately building up momentum one way, and then there's TV, and then there's everything else in life, and then you think that an hour in church once a week is going to stop that momentum, you got rocks in your head. We need to give our children everything we can to build up momentum in God's direction and counter the momentum of everything else around them. So I believe it's so very important that we put our kids in Christian education. Homeschool, Christian school, however you choose to do it. But our kids deserve us giving them momentum in the right direction, and in their young years shielding them from the overwhelming momentum of the wrong direction. I mean, how much are our kids worth to us? Some people will live in a hovel just to find pleasure. Would we live in a hovel to get our kids the right momentum? Or do we just not have the money for it? Do you get what I'm saying? You need to think about this. Because we're going to end up where we're headed. And we get headed in the wrong direction unless we deliberately head in a different one. And unless we deliberately direct our children in a different one. Because the current around us is overwhelming. That's why you need the church. What is the church? It's not a place where people pick on you for your sins. It's supposed to be a place where we lock arms. And we work our way up the current together. So that if you slip, I've got you. And if I slip, you've got me. Because there's a lot of momentum going against us. And we're working against the momentum of the world. As we build up our own momentum of following Jesus. We're filled with a world of powerfully weak people. We're called to be a weak, powerful people. Our strength is weakness. And we are made strong in His strength. The world's way, get power and control, and find yourself under the control of what you've given yourself over to. Or God's way, give up power and control and find yourself empowered by the one who has all power. And His love. And His joy. And His peace. And self-control. Boy, Pilate needed some of that, didn't he? The fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace. The way of the world, survival, pleasure, and striving. You may find some pleasure on the downward road, but you won't find joy. and you won't find love, and you won't be at peace. You're going to end up where you're headed. Let Jesus use the means he has put in front of us to check our momentum. Slow us down so we can take the off-ramp and head up the path. Let's pray. Jesus, may we at least be willing to slow down once a day and lose the momentum that we've built and find a new momentum in you. May we accept as a precious gift your Sabbath, which stops us in our tracks once a week. Makes us look at the speedometer and the direction. Get our perspective. Get our momentum in the right direction. May we be brave enough to have our greed checked as you ask us for the tithe, which shows us which direction our heart is headed and whether we really trust you. Lord, may we see in these things that sometimes we see as oppressive rules, means by which you are seeking to arrest our headlong flight in the wrong direction and keep us on the narrow path with you. Our salvation is only in following you, but thank you for some speed bumps along the way to keep us from getting off track and getting up too much speed. May we walk with you. We pray in your name. Amen.